Welcome to the GreenPilled.network podcast. If you're just joining us, we're building a coordination, a network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers using crypto to bring positive sum digital systems to the world. This podcast features the people who are doing it, and we publish a season of 5 to 10 episodes every couple months. This season is about how to DAO. Myself and my co-author Punkar have released a book entitled How to DAO that is all about the why, the what, and the how of DAOing. How do you start a DAO? How do you join a DAO? How do you think about DAOs in a way that's native to DAOs and not just from the old world and old organizations? If you're interested in picking up the book, you can get it at howtodao.xyz. And for the next couple months, we're going to be dropping How to DAO Alpha on the Green Pill podcast. If you want to learn more about the Green Pill podcast, you can visit our website at greenpill.network, where you can download the Green Pill book for free, join the Discord, and become a member of your local Green Pill chapter. All right, today's episode is Ideas for 2025 Public Goods Funding Builders with Juan Benet. We are on a tear, interviewing Vitalik Buterin, interviewing AI16Z, and next up, I've got Juan Benet, the founder of Protocol Labs, inventor of IPFS and Filecoin, which has been driving innovation in decentralized web technologies and building more robust foundations for our digital future through IPFS, Filecoin, and the other stuff that is being built in the Protocol Labs ecosystem. And joining the discussion as well is Sejal Rekhan, who is a grants innovation lead specialist at Gitcoin. And today we are talking about how to think about building public goods in 2025. So in this episode, we cover a real breadth of things with Juan. We talk about where we are at the end of 2024. What's the lay of the land? What are the experiments that are being done? Where are we starting to scale? And where is more experimentation happening? We talk about how to speed things up when it comes to public goods funding Legos and the composable modular funding structures that are going to allow us to build a lot faster, better, faster, cheaper than we ever have before. And then we get a little bit meta. We talk about how are we actually going to fund the builders who are building the public goods funding mechanisms. And from there, we get into all the different mechanisms: credit assignment, retro public goods funding, deep funding, drips, AI and allocation, hyper certs. Juan is just... I think that the number one thing I admire about Juan is just his curiosity. He knows about so many different things, and I think that he's just kind of self-taught on all these different levels. And Protocol Labs has the capital and the vision and the ambition to do something really cool in this space. And always enjoy talking to Juan about public goods funding, capital allocation. And this episode, I think, is a great snapshot of what builders in 2025 should be focused on. So I think you're going to enjoy this episode with myself, Juan, and Sejal. The next voice you hear will be myself and Sejal introducing Juan. Enjoy. Hi, Juan. How are you?
Doing very well. Thanks for having me.
Very excited to talk to you about public goods funding in 2025 and what ideas builders should be focused on in 2025. I'm wondering if you could start us off by giving us sort of a lay of the land. Why does this matter? What are you excited about? And, if you could just give us a breadth of the ideas that you're thinking about when it comes to ecosystem building and public goods funding as we cross into 2025.
I personally think that the ability to rewrite how funding structures and economies work is one of the most exciting things in the crypto space. It's the thing that it's not the reason that initially brought me to crypto, but it's the kind of like why I stayed longer term sort of thing, where I think the leverage that we have as a community and being able to make new experiments with different kind of funding mechanisms and new kinds of economic structures and incentive structures is incredibly powerful and could help rewrite how the future works and how future organizations, nations, communities all work. And I'm especially keenly interested in helping accelerate R&D in sort of science and technology translation and so on. And that's where improving mechanisms here could lead us to a much better landscape where we can do more science faster, and we can extract the fruit of science in terms of technology and products faster. So many good ideas we've come up with a good conceptual results, but we haven't been able to translate that into better kind of improvements for the world. And so I think very concretely where we are today is that the whole community, compared to maybe 2020 or so, we've done a really good job exploring a lot of the idea space. Like we've over the last few years have tried a lot of different kinds of things, everything from initial experiments with credit assignment and dependency networks to then experiments with better grant funding mechanisms and better ways to collectively vote on and assign funding, better mechanisms to incentivize the funding of public goods. Things like what quadratic funding, merge both of those ideas and so on. And we've also explored a lot of like more kind of like next generation type ideas, things like hypercerts, things like retrospective funding, and so on. And we've done a lot of really good experiments that have illuminated some of the things that seem to be working, some of the things that don't work. And in general, we've been able to like do a lot of like good point experiments. We've also been able to scale funding quite a bit. So today, the crypto world flows a very large amount of capital to a lot of the production of goods, both in in like these new kind of mechanisms and also in like kind of standardized grant program type things. We're talking about like, first of all, like tens of millions of funding per year, like close to like 100 in lots of grant programs around the ecosystem. And we're also talking about probably the largest scale retro funding structure, which is like the block reward, powering all the deepened networks. I kind of classify that mechanism and that structure within the same kind of public goods funding model. And that is, like billions per year, which is like really, really massive. And that's kind of like the potential here. Like we can get to a model where we are allocating billions to tens of billions per year through these kinds of mechanisms. And so I think kind of where we are currently is that there's, through a lot of these experiments, we've found a set of ideas that work. Those illuminate maybe what we should be doing next. Like they show a set of like possible next experiments. There's a lot of capital allocators now taking these kinds of mechanisms much more seriously. There's a lot of DAOs and treasuries whose charge is to improve the networks that they are associated with, and they need better and better mechanisms to try and do that. Better ways of like deciding what to allocate, better ways of collecting, sourcing funding, and so on. In the podcast that you did with Vitalik, you kind of went into a little bit of a division between one is how do you source the funding, and the second, how do you allocate it. I think the good news here is the protocols over the last few years have been able to source and allocate a very large amount of funding towards public goods, but we don't yet have very good mechanisms on how do you granularly distribute that and allocate it to smaller projects that are very, very impactful. So that's kind of where I would focus a lot of attention. Maybe on the sourcing of funding side, I would focus attention on this idea that in general, new networks that get built should be allocating some large percentage of their emissions or their token supply to public goods funding. So I usually kind of recommend, at least 10%, but, closer to 20 or 25% if you can swing it over the long term. And you want that allocation of funding to be following kind of like this cone of impact closer to the things that matter to your community, but then extending to like the deeper and deeper and longer term dependencies. So, maybe initially you start by funding things that are, very close and immediate to your project. So things like, goods that you need right now, like software libraries that develop the product or something like that, or some other kind of project. And then the deeper dependencies include some of the scientific research that needs to be done, or some of the support for a lot of the people in the community that are expanding the scope of the network. And so that I think from the sourcing and funding, like that's kind of, we're in a really good place, and there's of course more to do, but we're doing well. On the experimental side of how do we allocate that funding, again, we have a lot of like really good experiments, but we are seeing maybe we have a good gradient of like what next experiments to do. But my sense is like we're not able to experiment fast enough. So I think from my sense of kind of where we are, I think we're reaching a point where there are many more ideas and potential projects to do than our capacity to like actually do them. And we need more people and more we need to increase the rate of experimentation across the ecosystem. And that could happen in a few ways. One is by dropping the cost of experimentation, by building like more modular and composable tooling that enables people to like experiment faster. Second is by coordinating better across the ecosystem of like making it cost a lot less time to talk to people about these experiments and kind of convince them to try things and whatnot. So like doing some amount of the communications coordination work. And third, which I think is probably most important, is we need a funding structure for PGF builders. So I think like one of the issues is that PGF mechanisms in general tend to have haven't yet had a strong take rate in a sense. And so there isn't that much of a financial sustainable element in PGF building. And because, whenever you're in PGF land, people tend to think, oh, like we're just doing, sort of like good charity work. And like, that's not the point at all. It's like we're creating valuable allocation mechanisms that net back a lot of utility to the individual networks that are producing these goods. And you need some kind of financial structure there that supports the R&D that goes into the PGF funding itself. And so that part, I think, it requires a lot of work next, where we should be creating kind of like some conventions or standards of like what percentage overhead is like the right amount of percentage overhead for developing the PGF mechanisms, because that's what's going to enable hundreds or thousands of builders to go out there and develop new kinds of mechanisms and try out new things, sample the space, do more experiments, and figure out what works. Today, a lot of the PGF builders are basically rate limited by not being able to kind of like have enough capital to pay a lot more people to do this kind of experimentation. Like when you compare it to, say, the number of people working on scalability technologies, it's kind of crazy. Right? Like how many additional, L2, L3 scalability frameworks do we need? Like, it's a super saturated space. And that's there because there is a very large amount of funding going towards those kinds of solutions. Like the world kind of has prized those well and reward those and whatnot. And so that generates a lot of attention towards those. And in reality, this other stuff, this PGF allocation stuff, might end up being dramatically more impactful to these networks and communities, but currently doesn't get this kind of like attention or allocation because there isn't currently like a super clear and viable business model and path for PGF builders. And so I think one of the core things that we need to do as a community is like refine those and set some good standards and very clearly show that because this is solving a huge key problem for the space, it needs to get well rewarded. And that'll kind of like help generate, this whole like builder funnel for PGF builders where like, it'd be amazing to be able to see, every single hackathon in the community having prizes for new kinds of PGF allocation mechanisms and making it viable and possible for new builders of PGF mechanisms to take those and turn them into some kind of business for themselves and for others, where like if they can kind of create an important improvement and it can help improve a lot of networks, they should be, greatly rewarded for doing so. And so I think that kind of like problem, if we solve that problem as a community first, then we're going to enable like a ton of other PGF builders around the space. And yeah, and then it's sort of like beyond that, I think that there's a lot of interesting solutions that have been, or a lot of interesting ideas that have been explored in the last year or two. And, maybe like a bunch of like interesting next steps to take you sort of across the board. And so maybe you can like dive into a few of those.
Yeah, let's do it. First, I want to recap what you said, and then we'll dive into a couple of those experiments. So, a couple of the themes that I heard in your answer, Juan, which was, I think, conveyed a real breadth of the lay of the land in 2025, is that there's starting to be more and more experiments that are done. But I think that there's an opportunity to speed up things in 2025, increasing the number of builders building PGF mechanisms. Vitalik said in our episode with him that 2025 should be a year in which funding infrastructure is elevated to a first-class status alongside things like DAOs and DeFi as something that we worry about in the space. And so how do we manifest that? Well, we should fund the builders that are building funding infrastructure. We need a structure for that. And then also there's a lot of power, I think, in these composable modular funding structures where you have like take deep funding, for example, it's got OSO doing data, Gitcoin doing weaving, pairwise for selection, and then AI agent. Like the specialization, I think, and the pluralism of those things working together is just that composable modular funding infrastructure, and you can go way faster with those structures. Those are things I heard in Juan's answer. Sejal, do you want to play anything back that you heard? And also, next question, I think should be for you, Sejal.
I actually love the fact that you emphasize always on R&D for the mechanisms, right, that is needed. So this is something that I would love to know from you, like how do we balance the need for like rigorous research and then also the urgency of implementing it fast, right, and testing it out?
In order to kind of build high quality, successful things that, end up improving the status quo, you have to do a lot of product iterations, and then you end up needing to do a bunch of research to advance the ideas and the science behind it. So a lot of these kind of funding mechanisms, because they're economic innovations, they tend to have very important game theoretic type ideas underneath them. So, everything from like assurance contracts, which is like the basis of how Kickstarter and things like that work, or dominant assurance contracts, which are like an improvement to that haven't been widely deployed, to things like prediction markets, to hypercerts, to like block rewards. Like all of these mechanisms have strong game theoretic elements underneath the hood, and that science and that idea space needs to be very robust and needs to be well researched. And at the same time, when you look at say academic game theory research, there's piles and piles and piles of papers of inventing lots of kinds of mechanisms and doing a lot of study of mechanisms, but few of those things is actually translating into wide use. And where there is wide use is where people are building products and deploying them out to users and so on. And so you have a ton of builders that are like actually trying to solve problems for themselves right away. And sometimes they come up and with really good new novel ideas. But sometimes the ideas are not as well tested or as rigorous and so on. And they could really like use a bit of literature review of finding out what other ideas have existed in the past. This is a fundamental issue in kind of building products and doing scientific research, where we need to kind of bridge those two spans. And sometimes there's one person that can like do both the product iteration and have like a really fast cadence to like deliver the product and deliver the good and get solve the problem, and they can simultaneously do the deep research required. But more often than not, it's actually teams of people that do both of these together, and you want like a wider community that is able to do both of these things at the same time. Our practice in this broader community of publishing what we're doing, talking about it, discussing it, talking about like the problems, the next ideas, and so on very widely is very good to stimulate that kind of discussion. I do think that we need a lot more strong kind of like research background folks in the space. I think we have a really great supply of builders, but less kind of like deep analysis and deep research. And this is where I think I think Funding the Commons as a community started with the goal of like bringing a lot of these community groups together, and has succeeded to some extent. I think we need an even like stronger version of that. Like I wonder if there's like a need for both like an academic format style conference where we like talk about these kinds of people like actually publish papers on like this sort of stuff, and like you like nerd snipe a lot of the deep game theory researchers to help prove things. And then on the flip side, creating a valve for a lot of the people that have spent their time researching these things in theory to then actually have positive global impact in terms of like getting their ideas out into the world and used by millions of people, or like benefiting hundreds of millions of people. Like that would be kind of like a really great setup. Again, I think it also comes down to like funding mechanisms, like having the ability to form these teams with funding so that they can like go and productize the solutions is kind of required. Meaning, in the early days of cryptocurrency world, the cryptography community had come up with tons of great innovations that were stuck in academia and had not yet been translated. And it was really the cryptocurrency world that emerged with large piles of magic internet money that suddenly was able to fund a huge amount of that cryptography research and get it out into the world. Like zero knowledge is one perfect example of this, where huge amounts of research had been done in zero knowledge and advancing the field, and all of it was stuck because there was no like broad application. The blockchain cryptocurrency world needed those applications and had the money to fund the work. And then you had like all of these kind of hybrid academic and technologist and product builder teams that were able to kind of push the frontier forward and do it, right? And so I think we need some kind of similar type of situation here with these kind of better funding primitives, where we kind of need the big funding results to be available to those so that those teams might form. And I think it starts with like the DAOs and treasuries that are trying to do this funding allocation. Is like they need to be factoring in some significant overhead in their deployment of capital to go to the groups that are doing the R&D of improving the mechanism allocation, right? At the end of the day, like allocating the funding much more effectively, like to produce higher scale of impact. Like, if you come up with a mechanism that like doubles the impact of the allocation money, like that's an amazing improvement that you should be willing to pay like a very large fraction of the funding for. And so if we I don't know, normalize some like take rate between 5 and 20% of the allocation going to the people that are helping produce that impact, that could be like a massive result. And then after that, then we can like prioritize optimization of cost reduction to like make it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to be able to do this kind of allocation. And there I'm like pretty excited about AI systems to be able to greatly accelerate and drop the cost in a lot of this kind of allocation work. So many of the PGF mechanisms that we have today are very labor intensive and communications intensive because they require externalizing a lot of preferences. Part of the reason why markets work so well is that they implicitly they don't force people to externalize their preferences by like verbally. You do it in like the action of buying and like the actual transaction, and like that's a super super powerful mechanism. And so we need some kind of like similarly cheap type of structure, potentially using markets or prediction markets to be able to do a lot of this PGF type of funding without requiring so much conversation, because the conversation can be very, very expensive. The other option is to just throw LLMs at it. Like we now have like conversation machines that can like, ingest vast quantities of text and information and be kind of like aligned to a set of preference values, and then you can kind of stick them on doing this kind of thing. So I would love to see some of the experiments I would love to see in 2025 include try and use LLMs for a lot of these kinds of mechanisms. So try to use LLMs in retro PGF rounds or in grant rounds or in prediction markets or in the deep funding stuff that Devansh and Vitalik and others are working on and usage of. And so I think like those kinds of experiments I think could be really good at like dropping the cost. But I think like first and foremost we should like very strongly normalize the kind of like allocating some amount of funding to the builders themselves, because that's what's going to drive the optimization here and like enable us to sample so many new ways of doing this allocation.
Yeah, I love that. That's definitely one of the goals that I have to, how to bring the right people together, because I feel the mechanism space needs that kind of an exploration, which is a bit academic, but at the same time, this fast implementation, right? Like, for example, we had one session on Shapley values, and we figured that the weights of the graphs can actually be identified using Shapley values, right? We need PhDs to do that. So there are solutions that exist in academics, but that, gap needs to be bridged in a way which has that sense of urgency also. So,
Yeah, let's maybe dive into some of the kind of interesting experiments that we could see in 2025. So, one of the things that we've seen advance a lot in 2024 is the Optimism retro PGF type programs. So, Optimism pushed the retro funding idea into this like round-based structure that has been really successful. They've been deploying, I think, close to $100 million or more already through it. And that has been quite successful in like funding a lot of critical dependencies for both the Optimism community and the broader Ethereum community, and has gone to like a bunch of dependency projects. And that program inspired the Falcon retro PGF program and the Lipido retro PGF program, and just these kind of like other retro PGF programs that have been kind of following that model. This kind of program is also seeing a lot of experimentation. I think the open source observer folks and other folks are like refining these programs to try and again drop their costs and increase their impact. So they experimented this year in doing like metrics focused rounds, or rounds where like you get experts to indicate metrics or to weigh metrics and to kind of like help tune an algorithm. And I think those are like very, very good experiments that can help again decrease the cost of doing the allocation, but also ideally, most importantly, increase the impact, because you really like all of these mechanisms should be first measured on impact and then second on cost. And so I think those are like pretty good ideas, and I think we should see those ideas percolate to the other similar kind of programs in 2025. So it would be great to see some more experimentation in this direction in Phil retro PGF and WP retro PGF. Separate from these, I would love to see more retro funding experiments that just don't have humans in the loop at all, or like where you like greatly minimize them, or they're faster cadence. Like one of my gripes with the current way that these programs work is that the cycle is just very, very slow. It's like, a 3 to 6 months cycle each time. And that doesn't allow a lot of faster optimization. And so getting into a mode where the cycles can be much faster, closer to like block rewards. Part of the reason why block rewards work so well is that they happen every single block, right? Like the blockchain like just rewards on an ongoing basis, and like that's fantastic.
I felt like I could add value by pointing out that I did an episode with AI16Z in which they talked about using AI to bring the quarterly rounds down to weekly or even like daily. Like if you have that amount of intelligence processing, then you can provide instant feedback loop. And the difference between what retro funding is all about, a faith-based agreement that if I do something good for this ecosystem, I will get paid eventually. And it has to be faith-based only until you get the money. And if you have that feedback loop on like an hourly or daily basis. I mean, I'm just saying, making your argument back to you at this point, but like it's interesting how like the big brains have all independently converged on this direction.
Yes. Yeah. I think there's like a everyone is like wants the allocation to be faster, is pointing out that AI can be like a really good way of doing a lot of the intelligence work. And yeah, I think like, these kinds of mechanisms, the reason they work is because you have like this public reward that everyone can see, that everyone, is committed. It's an advanced market commitment in deploying this funding towards this kind of good, and that causes a lot of people to do that work. It's just that the cycle distance is so long, and especially if you start changing a lot of the rules and do a lot of experiments, which you want to do to try and find the better structure, but that also like changes the game a bit on people, and so it's hard to like stabilize the mechanism and whatnot. Like one of the things I love about the block reward structure is that it's just so clear and direct and so fast that you can have these like large protocol emissions associated with this incentive, and then in a matter of like a few months to a year, or even a few years, you have these enormous scale infrastructure networks being developed, and that drops out of like the consistency of the mechanism and the frequency at which it adjusts, right? Like, so it adjusts on a per block basis. But yeah, I think even like adjusting daily would be good enough. I think weekly probably also good enough. I think once it starts getting into monthly and quarterly, it feels very slow. Now, of course, very naturally, like if you need the input of tens of people, like yes, you're going to end up in like a months long process. And so yeah, I think very excited about like using AI models or using more metrics type things and so on. I think like this broad set of mechanisms, which a set of us like kind of described as impact evaluators. That's not a great name for them, but like I think that this whole class of mechanisms should get a lot of experimentation in 2025. So I would point a lot of builders towards these. And one of the things that I think, talking about another mechanism structure, one of the things that can enable a lot of this experimentation is going towards much more composable modular funding routing. And so one of the things that I've been pushing for a few years now is like this model of doing these networks of funding allocators, where you try and get these mechanisms to be as small and self-contained as possible, like very Unix philosophy type, where one small thing doing it really, really well, and then you kind of wire up the mechanisms. And when you look at like private capital and the successes of VC and the successes of many other kind of financial industry systems, it all drops out of like this very clear, composable, modular structure that is achieved through like the idea of a fund. Like when you can create a fund, you can like raise money on one side and then deploy money on the other side. And then if you're successful, then you like return more money. And if you're unsuccessful, then like the fund loses money. But like that composability is super applicable and is what gives rise to like this massive scale capital system. And so getting to like that same kind of like modular structure in PGF, where we can have like these kind of like money routers in a sense, being able to raise money on one side and then allocate it on the other side, then have like a strong sense of like metrics and impact that can allow the funders to decide whether to increase the funding or decrease the funding in the next round, will help a lot. And one part is to kind of disseminate and socialize this idea and get more people to do it. The second part is to actually build composable primitives with software. And this is one of the reasons I'm like super excited about Allo and all the stuff that you're doing, Kevin, and others, because Allo is like like the right structure to be able to compose all of these kinds of mechanisms into this kind of network where you can very cleanly and clearly see these are the set of mechanisms that exist. Here's how they wire up together. Here's what each one of these mechanisms is supposed to do. Here are the participants of this mechanism, and like getting all of that clear metadata to be composable and on chain and like easy to route through will be super, super, super valuable in getting all of this experimentation to speed up, right? So I think like one of the things I'm like really excited for 2025 is like enabling a lot of PGF builders to spend way less time on all the rote like operations side of running one of these programs, which is kind of like, oh great, like how do you go and raise money from people, and how do you like once you have figured out your allocations, how do you distribute it out to people? Like I've just seen so many people spend an enormous amount of time having to deal with like, oh, you have to like give this thing to this person, you have to KYC that person, and it's just all this builder energy is going into like solving road problems that shouldn't be there. And if we can like build some software primitives and infrastructure that enables PGF builders to just be like, oh, I'm just gonna take a smart contract and deploy it, and like that's my PGF mechanism, and like you're good to go, and you can like get added to the network, and automatically you can have something kind of like DeFi Llama, but for PGF mechanisms where you can see like, here's what the allocations are happening, here's what they're doing, here's like the impact metrics, like that level of kind of both financializations and like instrumentation will be fantastic. And like once we can do that and drop the cost of innovating here, we're going to be able to get like hundreds of builders to try out new mechanisms, and so on. And so I'm pretty excited about like that composability and modularity in the design space.
Sejal, next question for you.
Yeah, one of the things I would love to understand is, do you think it's possible to align the principles of public goods with the financial dynamics of startup ecosystem, like such as venture-like returns? Like, what would that look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like venture style returns means like a 100 or 1,000x return on the initial investment, and that's sort of needed in order to fund these massive scale product build out, right? Like the amount of product, like people that you need to build something like Airbnb or Coinbase or something like that. It's just like you need hundreds of thousands of people working on it, and so that's why like you end up with these like institutions that require enormous amounts of capital and therefore need to return massive scales of capital. I don't think we need to go that high. I personally think that like getting like a 2 to 5x return is like really good, and if you can do that in a pretty fast space, you could like have a lot of success. So I think we can end up with a model and system that is like VC-like in that there is some initial investment and there's some return later, but the numbers can be much smaller because you don't need hundreds of thousands of people to create new mechanisms. You need like somewhere between 1 and 10, and that alone could like generate a lot of experimentation. So I would say we should normalize the idea that you could go on like a venture in a sense, in terms of you're going to come up with a new idea, you're going to potentially raise a little bit of funding initially to be able to do the R&D work for a new mechanism, and then you're going to get a very strong reward by being able to create a business on the other side of like making sure that the groups that use your mechanism can route some reward to you. But I think that return, could be anywhere from like 1.5 to 10x. Like it doesn't have to be 100 or 1,000x. Like if it is awesome, or like if you created something so valuable and so great that like the entire world is like fine giving you a 100x return multiple on your initial investment because it's like that valuable for the world, like great, awesome, like more power to you. Hopefully allocate that wisely as well, and like route your funding to other projects that really matter. But what's most likely is that like a much smaller return multiple can be like really valuable here. We just have to normalize that transaction and that structure. I think like in general, people tend to not like evolving markets is one of the things that happens kind of organically, and like one group starts doing something and it shows that it's a strong result, and then everybody like copies it and starts doing it as well. And so I think here we just need a few groups that do this, that like just commit to like properly rewarding the folks that do these kinds of innovations. And if it works really well, like a lot of other parties are going to copy it and scale it. And so I think it's something that like I'm already, in the set of PGF mechanisms that I'm working on, we explicitly account the OpEx cost of running the mechanism and doing the work involved in it. And we like quantify it. Like today, like the overhead is massive. Like some of these like have an overhead of like 40%, which is crazy, right? Like you ideally want that overhead to get closer to 5 to 10%. But that's fine in like the early stages of R&D of a new mechanism, and that's good. And so like we're fine with that kind of like initial investment. And I think like we're normalizing already, like factoring in the costs of doing the work of doing allocation. I think the next step beyond that is like factoring the idea of like creating like a mini company or something that is doing this development and then get some reward in the long term. And I think this could also happen in smart contracts, right? Like you could have like a very simple smart contract that like represents that little company and has like some splits associated with that in terms of like the people that contributed to it. The good news here is that because we're doing all this like credit assignment work, we get to like kind of like dog food our own stuff. And so like we could create like these very simple kind of mechanisms on how to reward the people that like contributed to the creation of this. Maybe this is something that Allo could also work on, is like have a clear community of builders that are PGF builders that are working on this stuff that then we kind of like make visible in the network. Like not only do you see like the network of allocators, but you also see the network of builders building the mechanisms. And then maybe we can like drop the cost of innovation here by enabling these like groups or like teams to form that then can like get rewards together or something like that. And I think that can like help normalize the whole thing.
There's kind of like a, speaking of the modular structure, to me, the primary modular things are, these are the mechanisms, these are the builders, these are the experiments that they're working on, these are the pilots that came out of those experiments. These are the results. And if you sort of think about those as each like data objects, they each have their own sort of relational structure with each other. You're kind of starting to see, I mean, it's just Legos of different types that are being assembled here, not to like abstract the beautiful human collaboration that we're doing into this like in a reductionist way, but I really want to like focus here on the composability of these things. And I think that there's a real opportunity to map like, oh, this mechanism is good at generating function and funding, and this mechanism is good at distributing the funding, and like even then you can string mechanisms together. And it's kind of like with money Legos, like you can do stuff way faster than you ever could because of the Legos that were available. And I imagine like I truly believe in my heart of hearts, because of this the how open source all these things are, that 3 hackers can walk into a hackathon and build a public goods funding mechanism just over their weekend better and faster and cheaper than a government that has 1,000 software engineers and a huge budget 10 years ago because of the open source Lego. And even it gets faster because once you build the funding infrastructure to fund the funders, then you have funding that you can drop on top of them. And
Yes.
so it just accelerates. And I think that that's what makes me really excited about this, is just the accelerating pace of innovation in the space. And we can only
Yeah,
reason about
it's gonna be awesome. I
2025,
completely agree. Yeah, I
but
completely agree that like
yeah.
a getting to an experimental model where a small group can do that R&D, be successful, and so on. Like I think will like supercharge this entire ecosystem. I think
Yeah.
the money Lego, like the um funding allocation money Legos thing, I think is like an idea whose time has come. Like a lot of us have been circling around this for a while, and I think like now we have like the
Mhm.
building blocks in place. I personally think also that finding like the large list of things that current PGF builders have to do to stand up a new mechanism and just explicitly going after cost reductions there will be very valuable, right? So like, oh man, everybody has to like incorporate some kind of entity in order to have like the legal structure to be able to get funding from a certain party to be able to route it. And then on the other side, you need to be, in order to be able to allocate the funding to a party, you need to like do some KYC or whatever. Like all of that is like stuff that you could solve once. Like you could have like one system that like solves that problem once, and then you let, you know, it becomes like really easy for like people to kind of innovate on top. And so I think like those kinds of cost reductions can help a lot here. Like just the friction to doing this is hard. Think of like the kind of innovation that was unlocked by Stripe Atlas, where Stripe Atlas let you incorporate a company with a few clicks, and like boom, like that enables just tons of people to create corporations. And so, or like the ability to have a bank account by just shipping a multi-sig that or like ship an organization by shipping a DAO, right? Like that's the kind of innovation rate that we need here. And so far, the PGF builders have had to deal with like super draconian cost structures, and like we have to kind of totally change that. Maybe another idea that I want to highlight like two more ideas that I think are super valuable for 2025. One is we're seeing a resurgence of credit assignment in general, which is really, really good. Like a lot of these ideas, that first started Gitcoin and SourceGrid and other projects were like, hey, you have a lot of information available to us in terms of like the dependency graph of projects and who worked on those projects and so on, how those things can combine to give you like a better set of funding mechanisms. Like that got resurfaced by Drips recently, and like Drips has been pretty successful in like creating like the dependency graph and like the drip splits and whatnot. But Drips itself did not like kind of give you a lot of power as a funder to like route it in a certain direction deep into the tree. And that's where I think like deep funding now added on top of the Drips dependency graph can be like super, super interesting and helpful, where like because you can see the dependencies on a large cone of interests for a particular project or community, you then get to like run a few different models on how you would do the allocation across that very large dependency tree. And then as a community decide where you want to allocate your funding deep into the tree. Like that is I think a very good unlock for a lot of this kind of credit assignment type of ideas. And I would even return to say like it may be really valuable for a lot of builders interested in this stuff to like go back and read some of the stuff from like the early Gitcoin days and early SourceGrid days on a ton of the ideas that came into these kind of credit assignment things. Some of the things that I haven't seen yet are like, we need to build very simple on-chain composable credit distributions. I think Drips List is a close version of that, but I think it's not even modular and composable enough. I would love to see this like kind of just in a smart contract where you can kind of like create a node in the graph here by just like submitting a smart contract into the network, and like you now have an on-chain primitive. Like I would love to have that. And once you have that as simple as that, then you build like one website that just aggregates all of these, like they can find them, and you can just see kind of like how the neural network is sort of like wired up. And that's if we build that infrastructure, then you can build things like deep funding and other things on top much more easily, because you can kind of like externalize this huge dependency graph and at least some idea on what the credit assignment has been so far, and then you can just keep adding to that by adding more nodes to that graph. And so I think something like that could be super valuable. I think another set of ideas that I think could be very powerful in 2025 is hypercerts. So I think hypercerts is probably one of the mechanisms that I'm most excited about. I think it has an extreme level of power. It's one of those things that's like as significant as maybe the invention of like the stock certificate, which kind of powered like the last few hundred years of industrial revolution and optimization and product building. And so I think like the impact certificate and kind of like hypercerts and implementation of that on chain is that level of powerful. And we just need a lot more builders trying experiments and trying to build different things with hypercerts. And so this is a thing where like I think the community needs to be able to like have a fast pace of innovation there. And I think like right now it's hypercerts ecosystem is kind of like rate limited by the same things that we were talking about earlier. Like there's just not enough people trying to build it because there's not enough kind of funding flowing to these ideas. So if maybe we create the infrastructure and normalize the idea that like by building better allocation mechanisms, you can get a strong return, and that helps bring a lot more builders, then a lot more builders can go to things like hypercerts and credit assignment and drips and deep funding and so on. I think in hypercerts specifically, it was like this really cool idea around using hypercerts to do sponsorship. So like think about how many sponsorships exist today for events. Like you could do all of the event sponsorship through hypercerts. The other thing is you could use hypercerts to fund long-term open source projects. So one of the things that we're trying out in the P2P ecosystem, we haven't like finished this. This is kind of like ongoing work, but we're kind of like going back and looking at all of the history of contribution on a per year basis. And then we're going to issue hypercerts per year for the project. And so you'll have a webpage where you can go and you can see like the kind of like contribution board for both the people working on the project and the people funding the project yearly. And so we'll have like a yearly history for, everybody who's been contributing to the P2P. And that gives us like these kind of like mechanisms on chain to play with for this kind of structure. And I think like that could be a pretty neat way of using the hypercerts infrastructure to fund any open source project, and kind of like it mixes with the fundraising and it mixes with the kind of like deployment of funding and so on.
Yeah, I think there's an amazing breadth of things that you mentioned there, Juan, and looking forward to articulate those to the community and route builders towards the best mechanisms. As we're bringing the episode to a close, I've got to start bringing us towards a coherence towards the end, and I'm going to ask my final questions. If we are maximally successful in 10 years, what does the world look like? How has the world changed as a result of this work being successful?
And look, 10 years is a long time. 10 years ago, people didn't think AGI was going to be a thing. And 10 years ago, people didn't think crypto and the financial system that we built was going to be a thing and so on. Like in a very quick span of time, we've been able to show that both of those things are happening in a fast scale. I think 10 years from now, I think crypto could probably grow 1, maybe 2 orders of magnitude in value. So this would be like going from like around 3 trillion to 30, maybe 300 trillion. Like that's maybe where I would put it. I don't think it'll grow more than that in that time frame, but it could. And so that starts putting crypto on the scale of like larger nation states in terms of our capability of funding things. And so by then, if we can solve a bunch of these kind of like hard funding allocation questions, we could have these networks funding at the scale of nation states. Like we could have these networks funding science and R&D in kind of like similar quantities as like, I don't know, NSF and AIH in the US, or like the equivalent agencies in the EU and in Japan and in China and in all these places. And so I think like the level of power and potential here is enormous. Like if we get these mechanisms right, then as crypto itself scales, the scale of capital allocated through them was just going to grow tremendously. So I think 10 years out from now, we could be like having this incredibly fertile ground for innovation powered by these mechanisms in a much more decentralized, efficient, more impactful way. And in 10 years, our experiments are likely going to start refactoring existing infrastructure, right? Like when you go look under the hood for a lot of the existing mechanisms that people use to do this kind of allocation in the traditional world, those systems can see a lot of improvement. And I think within 10 years, we'll likely see a lot of these kinds of mechanisms percolating into those models and mechanisms. So I think I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years from now, we start seeing like national agencies around the world starting to use some of the mechanisms that we're describing here to do their funding allocations. One idea that I think has an enormous amount of power that could be this kind of like, very fast rewriting of how the world works is prediction markets. I think like once you start mixing prediction markets with funding flows, you can very quickly show that this kind of like small network of experts can outperform like some more closed off network of experts that kind of has like a specific kind of mandate to do the work or whatever. And there's been a lot of papers that show that. And so I think like we could be doing dramatically more impactful and effective allocation of the world's resources, right? Like this could be hitting like the hundreds of billions of dollars per year sort of scale of funding allocation. And so I think like that's the space potential in terms of the quantity. Now, how that gets used, that would be like accelerating how science gets done, accelerating the translation of science into technologies and products that benefit the world. You could then start, maybe building impact markets, not just for green and carbon offset type things, but also for like reforestation and for the ocean cleanup or for many other kind of like broad public good type issues. You could also see these kinds of allocations starting to also inspire better models for private funding, where like maybe we can like build much more public and open and less kind of like walled garden type VC funds that end up working much more in concert with the networks and economies that depend on them. We could see just like this proliferation of much more regenerative and like positive sum and incentive aligned models like percolate through the world to kind of like help us achieve like this kind of regen utopian type of vision that I think a lot of us are super excited about.
Yeah. When you talk about the scale of this thing surpassing nation states, and I think about how much nation states fund and how much more effective on-chain capital allocation structures could be, this makes me so bullish. I'm wondering if there's anything that we didn't ask that you want to say. Juan, I'll go to you first, and then Sejal would love to hear your closing remarks.
Yes, and maybe if I could leave all the listeners with like a very small, concrete set of things to remember is like, one, experiment a lot in 2025. Like if you're not a PGF builder now, like consider, like come join us. Two, I would love to see all the hackathons out there starting to add PGF prizes for every single hackathon, just to like enable a lot more builders to do this. Three, I think we should normalize the funding streams to make sure that like PGF builders can get a significant return, because that's what's going to cause a lot of more participants to come through. Four, I would love any new network that appears to dedicate at least somewhere between 10 to 20% of their supply to PGF building, of course, weighted to the things that matter to your community first, but to be routed through these mechanisms. And then five, I would love for us to like, get ready. Like the bull run is happening in crypto, and crypto is very cyclical, right? Like we've been, it's possible that like that will disappear at some point, but I just don't think we're there yet. And so I think like we're likely to see a bull market this year in 2025, and then, some winter after that. And so for all the builders out there right now, leverage this time period to do very strong fundraising so that you can like weather the winter right after that. And so, five, like as a builder, like make sure that you take into account like the cyclicality of crypto, and like you leverage the bull run into the winter.
Thanks, Juan. Amazing. Sejal, any last words? Is there anything we didn't ask that you want to say as we close out?
Yeah. One thing I definitely want to ask is that I see you as a leader who's so invested in innovation. Where do you draw your inspiration from? Is it books? Is it people, experiences? And related to that, like if you could give 2 book recommendations or movie recommendations, what would that be? Since people will be watching this right before going into holidays.
Yeah, totally. Great question. So I draw my inspiration from everything that I come in contact with, like books, media, people, conversations, and so on. I would maybe highlight, there's a lot of like things that have been deeply inspiring to me, but I'll highlight a few that I think are extremely influential for me. Like one is Carl Sagan's Cosmos. I watched that at a very early age, and it was like deeply, deeply inspiring in my orientation towards science and discovering reality, and then and also having like this very kind orientation towards it. It's not like I think the world is just so conflict oriented today, and Carl just gave us like this extremely thoughtful, generous, kind way of seeing reality and truth and science. And so I think I would highly recommend watching the old 1980s Cosmos. It can feel dated now, but like you just kind of like have to get into it, and I think like it's just an amazing piece of work. The second one that I'll highlight is David Deutsch's The Beginning of Infinity, and that's a phenomenal book that kind of brings together different models of reality through different theories of physics, and also develops like a theory of knowledge and how humanity's curiosity and our development of more science and more technology bootstraps us into like this potential like great set of possible futures. And so I think that is like also deeply, deeply, deeply inspiring. I think I also highlight Mark Miller and Eric Drexler, who are helped build the crypto community like very early on in like the 70s and 80s, 90s. And I'll maybe highlight the Paratopia type of ideas that they pioneered. It hasn't been as like widely talked about, but I think you can find their talks online and so on. I think those are like super, super inspiring. And then maybe the last group I'll highlight is Foresight Institute, which Alison Dwebman and a few other people are pushing, is super deeply inspiring in terms of illuminating where the technologies that we have today and are experimenting with today are going to lead us in the next 5, 10, 20 years. And they are phenomenal in terms of highlighting where all of this stuff could go. Lots of different kinds of fields. And they gather incredibly inspiring people and give talks like online, and all of the videos are out there that you can find and watch. So I think that community is just deeply, deeply inspiring to be with.
Wow.
Sejal, you want to ask one last question? I keep on saying this is the last question, but Sejal's DM me and she's like, I have one question I want to ask Juan really quick.
Yeah, because I love knowing more about people. So I just wanted to ask, like, what's the one thing totally unrelated to work or Web3 that you absolutely want to tick off your bucket list in 2025?
Oh, in 2025. I'm really lucky in that I get to like, as soon as I sort of like want to do something, I kind of like maneuver to find a way of doing it. I think like I really love nature and I really love exploring nature, and I've gotten to be really lucky in getting to see a number of volcanic eruptions in person over the last few years, and so I really hope that we get to see another one this year. And just honestly spending a lot more time with my partner, and we're like fostering cats right now, and like the kittens are like incredibly cute and whatnot, so getting more time to do that. I think probably like more time to just enjoy life, I think would be great. But it's also like hard because there's so many exciting projects to do. So I don't know.
Yeah. I think we were on a call last week together and you had cats crawling all over you. And I'm sorry that we neglected the podcast listeners of that. But Juan, you remain an inspiration to us all. Thank you for dropping all these knowledge bombs on this episode. Hopefully this guides Web3 builders in 2025. And thanks again for coming on the GreenPilled podcast. Sejal, thanks for co-hosting. We just heard from Juan Benet, the inventor of Filecoin and IPFS and the founder of Protocol Labs. I am excited about this episode because I think Juan laid out a true breadth, a menu, an a la carte menu that you, builder, can listen to in 2025 and figure out where you want to route your resources, your attention, your capital in 2025. And so I hope that this episode was an interesting episode for you, but mostly I hope to, in 3 or 4 years, meet a builder that says this series of episodes that you did with Vitalik and Juan and AI16Z led me to my next venture. So that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to route the builders to the highest leverage and most impactful problems. Thanks again for listening to the GreenPilled Network podcast. Again, this podcast features the people who are building a coordination, a network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers focused on using crypto to bring positive sum digital systems to the world, like Juan Benet, like Sejal, like Protocol Labs, and like all of the builders that draw inspiration from them. If you value our work, you can collect this episode. Go to pods.media/greenpill to find all episodes and to start collecting. While you're at it, you may want to pick up a copy of the How to DAO book at howtodao.xyz. This is the DAO season of the GreenPilled podcast, and that book, How to DAO, is designed to be your guide to the future of DAOs, and you support the DAO movement by helping us climb that bestsellers list and picking up the book. So if you've been a long-time listener of the podcast, if you've gotten value from it, please check out the How to DAO book at howtodao.xyz. And while you're here, might as well make an offering to our algorithmic overlords. Please subscribe, rate, and review. Please tell our AI tech overlords that you like the Green Pill podcast. When you gratify us with your likes and sharing this episode with your friends, that helps us spread the Green Pill message, the regen message, the public goods funding, and Web3 message to the world. And I really appreciate your subscription to the network, and you're supporting our mission over here at Green Pill and Gitcoin. And I think this is a fun episode. I will see you on the next one. Peace.